Okay, so maybe I will get started in the interest of time. I know a few people may join a little bit later as we go through. Um, Excited to welcome everyone here today to our virtual event for the PEGASUS Institute. My name is Camille Savrol and I'm the events director with the Institute. Before we get into today's event, I'd like to firstly acknowledge that the land I'm located on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and it is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We offer this acknowledgement as a stepping stone towards honoring the original occupants, a testimony to the oppression faced by Indigenous peoples, and our commitment to creating dialogues aimed at addressing such systemic injustice. At PEGASUS, our mission is to reduce disparities, inequities, and social injustices, and promote global health through the lens of peace and sustainability. We're very grateful to be able to serve our community during this time and for the continued support of partners. Because of their generous support, we can present programs such as today's webinar for free. And our partners include Wilfrid Laurier University, the University of Waterloo, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, as well as IPPNW Canada. This virtual seminar is one of many to come. We've already done 2, and we have a few more lined up I'll talk about at the end. And our primary goal is education, but also connecting people for action, including research, policy, and advocacy. For today's event, we have 2 speakers lined up. We will start with Marcel, and then our second guest speaker will be Dr. Courtney Howard. I want to encourage everyone to join in the conversation. Time permitting, we will take some questions from the live viewer and audience, so feel free to submit questions using your Zoom Q&A feature at the bottom of your window tab. And with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Excited to welcome him, Marcel Boekeboom. I hope I said that right. Climate Envoy for the Kingdom of the Netherlands. As Ambassador at Large for Climate, Marcel is the dedicated representative of the Netherlands at international gatherings dealing with climate change. At home, he is the figurehead of national climate policy and connects the global to the local, policy to practice, and problem to solution. In short, he connects the dots. Marcel is an experienced all-around diplomat. He has worked on a wide range of topics such as food security, finance, trade, multilateral affairs, and development cooperation. And he did so in many countries and was posted in South Africa and the United States. Recurring themes in his work include sustainability, governance, and multi-stakeholder partnerships with an emphasis on youth. Marcel holds a master's in international relations. He followed the practice of trade policy program at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and completed an intragovernmental leadership program at the Netherlands School of Public Policy. A Dutch national newspaper ranked Marcel among the top 200 most influential people in both 2020 and 2019. And he was recognized as the Green Party leader by the Sustainable Business Community in 2020. In 2021, his name is on the ballot for the national elections in the Netherlands, and we're very thrilled to welcome him and hear from him today. Marcel, over to you.
Thank you, Camille, and it's a great pleasure being here, and also the context that you sketch in which this series takes place, and maybe to tell you that it's I was supposed to be there in person, but of course COVID-19 changed all that, so I'll do it virtually, and I'm actually very happy that I can make it this way. Let me start sharing my screen. There we go, because I made a little bit of presentation. You can see this, I guess?
Yes, we can.
Very good. Well, this title slide is in Dutch. It tells you climate diplomacy from zero to now. And that's what I will do the coming 20-25 minutes to take you through my work. And you can see this picture. This is my work these days, just sitting at a table, looking at a screen like many of you do these days. But for that reason, I go back a little bit further. And the year zero, of course, is not really the year zero. The year zero in my story today is 5 years ago, and I will say a little bit on the Paris Agreement, because that is where a lot of it starts. To be honest, we should have started much earlier, and I guess you know that. Climate science already told us 30, 40 years ago that there was a strong relationship between human behavior and global warming, and that if we wanted to change the course of that trend, that we had to change our own behavior and stop using fossil fuels. You know all about that. I actually stopped explaining climate change science when I went to a primary school, and I asked the students to explain what is climate change, and they did it in such a way that I thought, well, I can actually skip that chapter in any presentation from now. Nevertheless, if you have questions later on that subject, I'm very happy to take them, but let me take you through my work as we go. And you see a few pictures here, and although diplomacy and climate diplomacy in particular sounds almost a little bit James Bond-like, it's in a way it is going to meeting rooms, and as my previous slide showed, it's also sitting at a desk a lot of the time. This is about progress that you want to make sure it sits on paper, and that's why I refer to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is in essence a 17-page document with all kinds of articles on it, on which countries negotiated for quite a while. But of course, it's much more. It is also the capture of a global mood and the connection, and that's what Camille said in the beginning, I connect dots. It's also the connection between the science, government agreements, behavior of citizens, involvement of the private sector and businesses, etc. So this is a subject that affects us all in whatever capacity we sit at the screen now. And my role in all that is to kind of push the boundaries even further. The goals we set in Paris are still relevant today, and I'll just quickly go over them. The three main pillars of the Paris Agreement are that mitigation goal, and that is a very difficult term for just saying that we want to limit global warming to a maximum of 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, or rather strive for 1.5 degrees. That is what most people know of the Paris Agreement, but there's more to it. The second pillar of that agreement is that we have to adapt to the already changing climate, and still a little bit of that science. We have crossed the threshold of the 1 degree warming already, and in several parts of the world even more. In the part that I'm in, we actually tip the 2 degrees already. So it's indeed, it's going fast, and that is why that second pillar of the agreement, that adaptation goal, has to have quite a bit of attention as well. And perhaps you have followed the news earlier this week. There was a climate summit, a climate adaptation summit in the Netherlands. It just finished yesterday. And that was to elevate the importance of that adaptation goal to a higher level, at least at par of that temperature goal. Not because we are giving up on mitigation, but because it's as important, and especially since there is an imbalance globally between developed countries and developing countries. Whereas developed countries have to do the most in mitigation, in stopping the use of fossil fuels, developing countries, poorer countries, are facing the consequences of climate change to a much larger extent than we actually do in the richer part of the world. So there is an element of inequity, but there's also an element of solidarity in there, including in that agreement that I'm talking about now. And that brings me to a third pillar. The third pillar of the Paris Agreement is the financial pillar. A lot of this has to be paid for, and of course, many governments can do that alone. But again, I'm first of all referring to developing countries. They need help, and that is a promise that was made in Paris. But there is that Article 2.1c of the agreement, that third pillar, actually says that all financial flows have to be congruent with those other two goals. And that is a major task. And that is why I, as a diplomat, am also involved in talks with the financial sector, with the Treasury, because that is, in essence, the most influential article of the whole agreement. If we manage to actually change the course of financial flows, we might actually have a chance of reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement. You just see a few pictures here. It ranges from the EU on the top left corner to the G20 on the top right corner to a UN Conference of the Parties in the left bottom. And the bottom right as well, that is a huddle. That is where the real negotiations take place. And that is, of course, what we miss the most while sitting at home. The informal context between negotiators, between diplomats, between politicians. That is what worries me, and that what is perhaps stopping progress in a way. And then you might ask, but you do have that agreement already, so why do you still have to negotiate? Well, what we did in Paris was negotiate the framework. You could say we have built the framework for a global climate regime, but we still have to fill it up with all kinds of building blocks to actually build the societies and the economies of the future. So a lot of that still has to take place. I might go into that a little bit later if you're interested in that, because it's perhaps a bit too detailed for now. I'll just mention a few topics that I could go over. Geopolitics, I think, is relevant, especially since your part of the world is dominating the geopolitics in climate diplomacy a lot. When I first went to an international conference on climate change, that was the COP in Marrakesh, the year after the Paris Agreement was signed. It was in November 2016. During the conference, Donald Trump was elected, and that changed the dynamics in the conference a big deal. You can understand that. And the same happened just last week with the inauguration of Joe Biden, and me getting a new colleague in the United States again in the person of John Kerry. That helps a lot. A lot of progress on climate change and a lot of ambition raising that we still have to do hinges on the involvement of the bigger countries. Paris could be negotiated because the United States, the European Union, and China agreed on the way forward. If one of those three doesn't want to join for whatever reason, there is no progress. So that is why those elections in the United States were so important for climate diplomacy and climate politics. And then perhaps one more thing on the Paris Agreement. Already in 2015, when we signed the agreement, we knew that what the collective efforts, the collective plans of countries would do in real life would not be enough to reach those temperature goals. So we also agreed on what we call an ambition cycle. Every 5 years, countries have to submit new nationally determined contributions. That means that they have to submit new climate plans to the UN, and then the UN will calculate and add it all up to see whether we are actually bending the curve towards that 1.5 or 2 degree goal. And that was supposed to take place last year. COVID-19 ruined that calendar, of course, but still we have that obligation to ramp up our own ambition and to submit new plans. The European Union, and that is the context in which I work, already did so. The EU came up with a so-called Green Deal. It still has to be translated in an NDC, that acronym that I used for the plan that we have to submit to the UN. But that raised the bar considerably compared to 5 years ago, and that is the example we hope that convinces others to do that as well. Joe Biden has said that he wants to do that as well, and John Kerry just repeated that 2 days ago when he spoke to the conference in the Netherlands. So that gives us good hope that also others will follow, including Canada, of course. A few other things on this screen: influencing and a diplomatic toolbox. What can you do as a diplomat besides working on texts and agreements? That is, trying to find those connections with other countries that actually will take them to a higher degree of ambition as well. And why is that important? That is important because the Paris Agreement is a collective goal. The goal is binding for all nations together. There is no distribution mechanism or monitoring mechanism under that agreement. So you have to do it together. And that makes that we have to kind of hold each other and help each other to do that. And if a few big emitters don't join, they're not only affecting themselves, of course they do that because climate change affects us all, but they also have a negative effect on others. So there is an element of solidarity in there, but you have to find the connection with those countries, with some countries, to actually join others to still keep their promises as made in Paris. You see, that is a difficult and a fine balance, but still we have to work that way, and we do that in settings like what you see here. These are a few. Well, the first, the left, is of course the New York Times of 2015, where you see a happy picture which illustrates that we do actually reach agreements, in this case a landmark agreement, every now and then. But the two articles on the right, and Neil can read it, and perhaps a few others who are able to read Dutch can do that as well. But these are Dutch newspaper clippings of this week, telling us, first of all, will it work, diplomacy through the laptop? What does the world gain by having another conference? I can understand that skepticism. I can also understand that journalists ask those questions. Because it's not always visible what happens behind those screens, what happens in all those holes in which we do talk and negotiate and try to reach agreement. And my answer to that is, yes, we have to be more open about it. We have to show what the progress is, but we also have to be aware that the real action will also have to take place elsewhere. So the financial sector, the private sector, local governments, citizens, it's a whole range of stakeholders that actually have to move. And those diplomatic agreements are just one piece of the puzzle. If it is a piece of the puzzle like the one in Paris, it's a very important one, because I see it works as a motivation and an inspiration to many, but many others, perhaps we shouldn't even be so open about it or talk about it so much, because it's also a lot of technical progress that is being made, and it sometimes has the effect that it's illustrating that it's going slow, and it's perhaps motivating others to be slow as well. So, but those are the newspaper clippings that I'll just use to illustrate that. Sometimes, you perhaps recognize that that little statue. I think it's in Berlin, by Isaac Cordell. illustrating climate negotiations, old, bold men talking so long until they drown. Of course, that's not the case, and that's why I pair it to the that nice picture from Paris. But it's also illustrating that it's a fine line, it's a tight balance, and you have to sometimes make 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and that is sometimes, and that is why I show you this, not as easy as Bob Ross wants to make us believe. You can shape the world any way you want, and you can even make little mistakes and it still looks fine. No, climate diplomacy often is a Jackson Pollock painting. And you have to admit that you can only influence so much. You have to involve others, you have to connect those dots, and you have to find your way in that maze, in that complex picture that climate change these days is. And that is what sometimes makes me say that climate in itself is nothing. Yes, climate is something for climate scientists, but if you see climate as a policy field, you have to connect it to other fields. You have to make your decisions in the economy, in defense, in education, in all those other sectors where you have to find the right way forward and have your eyes on the horizon. These are long-term decisions, long-term issues. That is what sustainability is in essence. Can you maintain and sustain what you do at the moment? And sometimes you have to change. And my proposition here is we have to change a lot. But ultimately, we are talking about a very positive message here. And that might surprise you, because looking into climate science, we know that it's not all too rosy. We are going too slow, and we see the effects in practice. But ultimately, in policy terms, what we are trying to achieve is a society and an economy and a way of living that is clean, that is healthy, which is a nice connection to the PEGASUS conferences and the profession of many of you, and also something in which new jobs are going to be created, because we know that in a green economy there are more and healthy jobs than in a fossil fueled economy. So that is the positive story that I think we should have before us, and that you should perhaps take also to your own politicians and saying, okay, this is how are we getting there? What is the trajectory to that longer term goal in which we have a cleaner society? Not easy, but we can do it. Jackson Pollock. A few global trends, and I have to tell you this because this is why we should be motivated to go faster. That graph on the left, many of you know it. It is the so-called hockey stick curve, and it's having a sharp turn to the top, and that is what we call modern global warming. That is what the Anthropocene is. That is what human-induced climate change is. And this shows you, if you have a graph, and this is just 2,000 years, that we have such an influence. We also know that if we can do this, we should be able to reverse it as well. Although perhaps many of you have not heard the term runaway climate change as well. A lot of it will take a long time to actually turn back. But that is an important one. But at the same time, we are not talking about climate change alone. There is a strong connection to biodiversity loss. Over 1 million species are endangered again because of our behavior. We have lost many species already. This is a graph from a report that was published 2 years ago by the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystems, IPBES. And as climate science tolling the alarm bells a lot, this rang another alarm bell. And those two crises are connected. And the connection is our behavior. these two trends continue if we don't do something about it. And this is just as an illustration of the urgency of the issue. Some more global trends. Inequality, an important one to mention. I said it in the beginning. There is a reference to this in the Paris Agreement, but that picture on the top left, what you see there is climate-related emergencies in 2019. And you can see the map of the world. It is unequal. That's an unequal distribution of those disasters, and especially also when it comes to the response to it. Richer countries have more means to protect themselves than poorer countries, and that is the rationale behind the financial assistance, and also in terms of capacity that developed countries have to give to developing countries. But there's also an imperative here to change faster, because there is a connection with our behavior again. The other two graphs, population growth, you know all about that, and there is a link, of course, to the health pandemic that we are talking about, or the health crisis that we are in. But there's also another one, and that is on the top right, conflict. That one starts in the 40s. And you actually, and it's perhaps a little bit of a happy graph here, it's going down. So although we are a more populous world at the moment, conflicts are going down. And that is perhaps a little segue to more positive news, because we have also been able to reduce mortality. We have been able to bring down global hunger. Equity has come up. So there are many positive stories to tell as well, but those are under threat by the other two trends that I mentioned at the same time. So we cannot sit back. We have to work on all 17 sustainable development goals. That is the agenda that could kind of foster those positive trends and change the course of the others. Oh. Just some more news of this week. Again, global trends. The UNDP just issued a report today. This is posted this morning on the website of the UNDP, and they tell us that in a global survey, and they polled over 1 million people worldwide, that they call for wide-ranging action, and that is a recognition of the fact that this is a crisis, that they also see that they have a role to play themselves, and that governments and businesses have a role to play. And the poll itself says that 60 to 70% of the population worldwide sees that. And that is, I think, a very positive foundation on which we can build for the decade to come. And the second one, that's another report, also of this week. As you perhaps know, this week the World Economic Forum is gathering for its annual meeting online again. And for that reason, the WEF always publishes its global risk report. And whereas 10 years ago, you would see on the top of that list terrorism, digital issues, financial crisis. Since the last several years, you see the green squares. It's all about extreme weather, climate action failure, human environmental damage, biodiversity loss, and of course this year, infectious diseases topping the list. And that list of risks is composed of, after a poll amongst business leaders globally again. And these two reports combined give me hope and confidence that we can actually move forward, and that we can go and move faster. Then something on, and I don't know how I'm doing in terms of time. I'm spending quite a lot of time already, so I'll speed up a little bit. This is the broader society that is participating. these are just a few pictures from the Netherlands, where young people participate in debates on climate. And the right is a report that was submitted to the conference earlier this week by young people in the Netherlands who thought of adaptation measures. And that is what's happening a lot. So participation is picking up, influencing is picking up, and of course the political response as a consequence as well. I see a shift in the political response actually making climate change no longer a left or right issue. This is going cross parties in the political spectrum, and that is, I think, a very positive message as well. I'm skipping this because I said quite a lot on this already. These are just a few pictures of my practice, and I give you 5 examples of climate diplomacy, and I'm basically doing it all. So I'm engaging in multilateral negotiations, I'm part of the EU team, I'm engaging with countries one-on-one in bilateral diplomacy, also with your colleagues in Ottawa. Of course, I have to convince others in my own government to join me, the Treasury, Home Affairs, infrastructure, water, all those departments do have international connections, but also make up my credibility internationally. How we walk the talk at home also defines my own credibility internationally. So there is an element of home diplomacy in my work. And ultimately, of course, thematic diplomacy. And what we do there is work on black coal, for example, stop finance in black coal, talk to other countries on forests or related issues. So all these kinds of diplomacy are part of my toolbox. The year ahead, and that picture to the right, both pictures are actually taken in the General Assembly in New York. When Donald Trump was in the room, I was there as well. I didn't take this picture because the Netherlands is sitting to the other side of the room in the UN. But we were all watching our clock actually to wait for him to leave because he has been blocking the progress for 4 years. And now John Kerry, signing the Paris Agreement in this picture, is back to make up for 4 years lost. But it's also a very full calendar the year ahead. Of course, hampered by COVID-19, and all eyes on the conference of the parties in November. Fingers crossed if it's going to take place in Glasgow. This is a long list. I won't go over it. I've said quite a bit on it already. But this is also my final picture. And perhaps this is a kind of a menu for you to choose from, or maybe other things, so we can start a discussion or questions and answers. So I'll stop sharing my screen here, Camille and Neil, and we can hopefully engage in some questions and answers. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Marcel, and maybe we can get your video back up too as we talk. So just I'll put a few questions together just in the names of time. So one is my own question in terms of the specifics of the Netherlands context, given reclaimed land and so the disproportional impact perhaps possible of climate change on the Netherlands, whether that changes the political context within the Netherlands and engagement of the population. A second question from an environmental studies professor, Mary Louise McAllister. She has 2 different things. One relates to the US context and re-involvement under Biden and how that facilitates progress, and also just your background as a diplomat in terms of corridor diplomacy and the importance of that context. Her background is in governance. And then Steve Ferracuti, who is has headed up Canadian Physicians for Aid and Relief, so worked in developing countries, asks about the LMIC countries, the low middle income countries, and their ability to make the needed changes in terms of technology, lack of affordability perhaps for them as opposed to high income countries, but also managing their social safety nets. He asked specifically about the mitigation, adaptation, and financial models and whether they take these things into account. So three questions, but and if we have time, we'll take a few more.
Yeah, but let me quickly do the first one on let's say the mindset of the population in the Netherlands. Over the centuries, the Netherlands has been quite good in adapting to, let's say, changing circumstances, fighting water issues, keeping the sea out and things like that. And we have become so good at it that the population actually takes that for granted. That's an interesting finding. The OECD did a peer review study a few years ago, and they labeled the Netherlands excellent in 6 of 7 categories when it came to water management, water governance. And one was poor, and that was water awareness. And that has to do with the fact, ironically, that we are so good at it. So that is an interesting find, I think. And so there's always an imperative to involve society and involve people to climate change action. But all countries have a different background. On the United States, I think I said a few things on that already. Very important that they are back at the table. But as with everybody, walking the talk is important. And if the Biden administration is not successful in changing its own climate policies and its climate politics because of a non-willing Congress, because of other difficulties, its credibility internationally is also at stake. So that is, I think, important to realize. And that is the same in Canada, of course. We see, and I'm in no position to point fingers because there's elements of this in the Netherlands as well. But we see a difference between Canada's international appearance and what they say, and also domestic interests and what's happening in, for example, the tar sands in Canada. And those two do not always go well together. But still, we find Canada on our side when it comes to climate diplomacy, and I think that makes good partners because we also can relate to our own domestic difficulties. And then the third issue is the situation in developing countries. Also on that subject, an interesting, or actually several interesting reports were issued just recently, also in the run-up to that climate conference in the Netherlands. One was on climate finance. And as you know, rich countries promised to get $100 billion together from 2020 on annually to help developing countries in their climate policies, both adaptation and mitigation. And those reports were critical. We are not reaching that target. And even if we do reach it, there is an element in there that part of it is not a grant, but a loan. So it's not really adding to the budgets of the countries that need it so much. And a lot of it is actually part of development cooperation. So it's risking to push out other programs. So that whole field needs to get more attention, and many countries actually have to live up to their promises on climate finance.
Okay, great. So thank you for that. There are a couple of other questions. One relates to a grade that you might give to Canada and its efforts on the Paris Accord, if you can give us a grade diplomatically, hopefully. And then a question about the donut economy. And this comes from Susan Kosvin, talking about the work of Kate Raffforth. Susan's a longtime advocate, activist with regard to various environmental issues, and is looking at the donut economy locally in Kitchener-Waterloo. But she wonders about the potential of this model, which Amsterdam has already embraced in some way, being adopted worldwide.
Marcel, if you can just unmute, I had to mute you for a moment.
Yeah.
Feedback.
I'm back. Grading Canada, I'm indeed answering this one diplomatically, and I'll just refer you to the Climate Performance Index. You can find it online. It's a very nice overview of how countries do in terms of climate performance. And what you will see is that they left the top 3 open. So no country in the world is actually doing what it should do. Then there's a list of countries colored green, not many countries in there, a large group of yellow countries, and many of the G20 and the G7 countries are in a kind of a red bottom corner of that table. Look it up. I guess Canada is somewhere around the end of the yellow and perhaps even in the red. So quite some work to do there. Then Kate Raworth, very inspirational, and not necessarily because of the revolutionary nature of her theories, but because of the way she presents it. She is able to get people behind it, to translate it into operational targets, for example, in the city of Amsterdam, as you mentioned. And that is her absolute value. She is really creating a large group of followers and a kind of a movement that is embracing the donut economy. I like it. I could even have put the donut in this presentation. I sometimes do that because I think it helps to visualize what we have to do. Our transition will have to mind not only the ecological boundaries, but also the social boundaries. And if we cross over one or the other, we will not be successful in the long run.
Yeah.
Or maybe, Neil, then I have to move on.
Yes, no, we appreciate this. Thank you for your time, and thank you for giving up an evening too, your time for us in Canada. We have a number of people online whom you may have known when you look at the list of attendees. So they have, some of them haven't seen you in this role. So I think that they are thanking you, but the rest of us really appreciate your the information you've shared. We also wish you luck in the coming elections in the Netherlands, and so hope to continue conversation with you in the future. Thanks.
Thank you. And as I said in the beginning, I was supposed to come to Canada. I couldn't make it now, but maybe one other time. And then PEGASUS, Waterloo, Ontario will of course be on my mind. And if it's not for professional purposes, I'll just come for a family visit. So thank you. It was good seeing you.
Excellent. Thank you. And
bye-bye.
So bye for now.
And good luck, Courtney, with following up.
Yeah. So now we'll go back to Camille, who will introduce our next speaker. But thanks again, Marcel.
Most welcome.
Perfect. We are excited to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Courtney Howard, who's going to talk to us around planetary health emergencies, everything from COVID to climate, whatever we can cover in 45 minutes. Dr. Howard is an emergency physician in Canada's subarctic, and if that doesn't keep her busy enough, she is also the first female president of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, otherwise known as CAPE, in the PEGASUS community. Courtney led the 2017 to 2019 Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change briefings for Canadian policymakers and was the 2018 International Policy Director for the Lancet Countdown. Dr. Howard has researched menstrual cups and wildfires and led policy work and advocacy regarding eco-anxiety, movement building, active transport, plant-rich diets, divestment, carbon pricing, coal phase-out, and hydraulic fracturing. She sits on the board of the Canadian Medical Association, the editorial advisory board of the Lancet Planetary Health, and the steering committee of the Planetary Health Alliance. She is a busy person. As chair of the advocacy committee of the WHO Civil Society Working Group on Climate Change and Health, she's helped launch a health recovery initiative that gained the support of 2/3 of the world's healthcare professionals. And then she ran for leadership of Canada's Green Party, finishing 3rd. She has now hopped back into medical advocacy and policy work, and we are so honored and thrilled for her to make time to speak to the PEGASUS group today. Welcome, Courtney. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me. It worked out well. I'm in the Emerge here. Air Canada just recently stopped flights to Yellowknife, so we're having to do all sorts of crazy things as we try to get people up to town. But he arrived, the plane was on time, and so here I am. And really a pleasure to be with you and to catch the end of the last speaker's presentation. It's a big year for the climate. And I think what is going to be really challenging for healthcare practitioners is that we really need to bring it on both fronts this year. We need to be coping with COVID in our local context, whatever it may be, at the same time as we really, really need to add our voice to the climate debate, because as Marcel was saying, it's a year where we really need to be increasing our ambition. And he was telling us how, from a diplomatic perspective, some of the tools in their toolbox aren't as sharp as they usually are, because they're missing that element of corridor diplomacy. And actually, as he was presenting, there was Doug Nottebrook, who's the locum who arrived today, does a lot of work with the ICRC. He was in the room, and we were having a little discussion. Well, how much more do you think you get done when you're in the room than when you're not in the room? And we figure it's somewhere between 2 and 10 times as much if you're able to pull people over in a corridor. So how can we as a health community help amplify the game of these climate diplomats who are trying to get so much done this year? And so we'll chat about that as we go. So this is a picture that I took as a locum myself about 10 years ago now, and I was flying between Inuvik and Aklavik. So this is the Mackenzie River Delta. That's the Mackenzie River there. And it was during freeze up, so about November. This is one of the most epic rivers in the world. It drains out of Great Slave Lake, goes all the way up to the Arctic Ocean. And this part of the world is already 3 degrees Celsius warmer than it was when an 80-year-old elder was born. So this is at the junction of Inuvialuit, Gwich'in, and Dene territory. And Indigenous people who live there very much depend on food from the land as a main source of protein. So you can imagine that as the ice becomes less stable, it makes for decreased safety of ice-based travel with food security consequences, mental health and cultural consequences. And really, it's where I learned about climate change and health for the first time. And it was one of these times where you do a lit review, and it was right after the Lancet had come out with its 2009 report that said that climate change is the biggest health threat of the 21st century. And I had just finished training at McGill, and I was like, wait a second, I just spent my 20s learning about the biggest health emergencies. What do you mean you missed the biggest one, really? And I looked up, and I think in many contexts, you could do a lit review like that and then talk to people around you and have people be unconcerned. But I happened to read it right at ground zero of climate change. And so instead I got stories from hunters saying, oh, things have changed immensely since I was little. Entire lakes are being kind of disappeared as permafrost underneath melts and they leak down, trees are tipping over. And so really it's highly motivating in terms of being a resident of the North and a doctor for these populations. And that's how I ended up kind of getting in on the ground floor of climate change and health work about 11 years ago now. So I believe that at this moment of concurrent planetary health emergencies, we need to really reframe our entire view of health. when I went to school, I really thought that health happened inside healthcare structures, like where I'm sitting right now. And, you know, I'm still very proud of the work that I do in the emergency department, but I see things very differently. And I think it's important for us to preserve both health and health systems for us to all change our frame. So this is a paper I published in the Lancet Planetary Health in September. These images are in the supplement, so you can go and download this image. And this is how I often refer to basically the overall frame now as a planetary health nest frame. So I now view overall health as being supported by ecological determinants like soil, climate, water as the necessary underpinning. And if that's all going well and things are pretty stable and we have focused resource, that gives us the sort of wherewithal to create social and political systems that build the social and structural determinants of health, things like income, housing, those elements we talk about now more now than when I went to school. And if that's all going well and we have really well-educated people and intact logistical supply chains, that gives us the opportunity to build and staff and supply the immensely complex structures where we conduct our acute healthcare work. And it's very humbling when you do a lit review, and I did this with the help of Trevor Hancock, who is very well known within planetary health and public health a couple of years ago. And across studies, across countries, we figured that about 20% of overall health status comes from healthcare. And so really, this is a planetary health frame. And the reason I like to start with this is that it makes it very clear that not only does, for instance, water have its own determinant on health, you know, you get thirsty, maybe wildfires are more likely, but in order for us to even have a hospital, everything underneath needs to be going well. So when doctors say to me, Courtney, like, you need to stop talking about climate change, you're very bright, but stop talking about climate change. I'm like, climate change is going to underpin, it's going to make it difficult for us to do our actual jobs in the hospital. And that's why you as a doctor need to care about this. And so how can we communicate this? I'd really encourage everybody who's taking this on to be very, very attentive to the mental health impact of the information itself. For a long time, I couldn't figure out why people who I knew had been trained in evidence-based analysis and conversation weren't immediately swayed by my arguments. You know, I've always done things in a very well-referenced way. And then I finally realized that it was making them feel sad. Making them feel sad, sometimes angry, sometimes guilty. And anytime we have those emotions, we want to kind of turn away from a problem. And so just be very attentive to the mental health of your the people you're speaking with, and do your best to present a very solutions-based approach, as well as to illustrate things with pictures as much as possible, because you'll just make more progress. So this image took me most of September, a couple of months, years ago, to put together, and it just illustrates some of the impacts in Canada. It's in the Lancet Countdown Brief from 2019, and it's a nice thing to put on the front of a policy brief, et cetera, if you're going to talk to a policymaker, because they don't have time to read through a multiple page, you know, 8 by 12, 12-point font kind of thing. And so let's just sort of back up pre-COVID, so about 15 months ago now. Where were we? Well, at the time, I felt like things were pretty acute. You know, this was when Greta Thunberg was leading these 500,000 person marches. Richard Horton, the senior editor of The Lancet, had just made a video for Doctors for Extinction Rebellion that was essentially encouraging physicians to basically live up to their ethical obligations to the world and endorsing nonviolent direct action. A good friend of mine, Dr. Robin Stott, in fact, did get arrested with Doctors for Extinction Rebellion. He wrote a commentary about it in The Lancet. And so really we were approaching almost a peak even then in this planetary health crisis. This is a picture I took at an eco-anxiety workshop I did at COP about 12, so the last one that was held. And I asked people to put up their hand if they were feeling burnt out. And you can see almost every single hand in the classroom was up. And to just give you a bit of context, we organized this workshop on about 2 days' notice. And this was the morning after the biggest party at COP. There's always this giant party. So The fact that we have a packed classroom on 2 days notice, the day after a giant party, tells me that eco-anxiety, stress, burnout in this community is huge. So how can we support one another at this moment where we know the burnout from COVID is also extreme to do the work that's required? You know, we just had someone come in with Pilo. Most days, it's very important to just remember that it could be worse, right? So to give thanks for the small things that we have, you know, I've got water, I've got coffee, I've got a muffin here. And really, I'm trying these days to make sure that I'm keeping my bucket full by being present and filling my bucket up with my kids and time outside and exercise as much as possible so that I have the energy I need to do the work. And this is sort of how I often conceive of this. So a lot of you will probably have seen the children's book that talks about, have you filled up a bucket today? And so it talks about, essentially conceptualizes energy as water in a bucket. So right now, when we think about all of the people that we're both working with and trying to influence as we're getting work done on the climate, everybody is coping with all of these things. So they've got withdrawals from their bucket in terms of uncertainty, financial worries, loss of their sense of place or role in the world if they've lost their jobs, different kinds of inefficiencies. You know, you go to work, everything's different every single time, bereavement. And so how can we lend energy to one another? So from the movement building literature, psychology around this, a sense of purpose. So a shared, I love that moment in Amanda Gorman's poem the other day when she talked about, was something like not thinking about what divides us, but what's before us. So what are the challenges, the joint challenges that we need to bring together? Thinking about our motivations, there's a lot of different emotions we can use to motivate each other. And we've just saw an outgoing president who is very, very much somebody who motivated with fear. I think that at this moment, with everybody really, struggling for various reasons, it's really, really important to be calling to the warmer emotions, calling to love, calling for a desire to take care of one another with these two joint planetary health emergencies. Patience, being patient with people, everybody's sort of personal life is just different. Their childcare might not be quite where it usually is. Sometimes people are having sleeping, they may be more cranky. So just really, I'm trying in all the spaces I'm in to essentially assume good intent. And I find that gets me very far, because generally speaking, people don't mean anything by what, a sort of cranky word. It's just they're coping as best as they can, bringing humor to different situations and offering practical help when it's possible. And really, like, why are we even talking about this in a presentation about planetary health emergencies? It's because essentially we have the technical solutions. What we have now is a people getting along and doing things together challenge. And so we really need to be taking all of this into account in our actions with one another. And when you think about it, this is an incredible moment. I'm sure many of you have read The Shock Doctrine, and she makes so clear, Naomi Klein, about how very much change is possible at a moment of instability. She talks about how really when things have been disrupted, it's all of the ideas that have been laying around that have a chance to be implemented. Well, we got plenty of ideas in the climate space. And so this is one we really need to be pushing. And so we need to be thinking about all of the different stages of this sort of process. So data, I'm just finishing up a wildfire study, should be published in the next couple of weeks. And so, I'm very, very sort of attached to generating good evidence, particularly on behalf of vulnerable populations. In many cases, for instance, downstream from the oil sands, we still haven't done the studies that we need to do on the local toxic health impacts of the oil sands. So we have a responsibility to generate data, but we also have a responsibility as health practitioners and a bigger community to translate that data. We can't just leave it on a shelf and expect some politician to go find it. Now that I was one for 6 months, I know those guys have zero time, like minus time. So we can't expect them to do that. So we can take the next step, translate it into policy. And that's important too. But again, thinking about the time available for people to absorb these policies, we need to be really thinking about it from an audience-centered point of view if we want things to actually happen. And so how do we actually make real change in the world? Well, for me, there was a really big jump involved in recognizing that in many cases, it wasn't about the references I had on a document. Those are really important. So I believe we need to choose evidence-based targets. We need our science super well aligned and well laid out. However, you know, moving from 15 references to 20 references isn't going to be the thing that's going to make the difference if we're not taking power dynamics into account. And that is something that we don't really get taught in medical school, and it's important that we think about that, because as health practitioners, we need to be part of this argument, because we know that we're the most trusted messengers, we're good science communicators, and we essentially are the natural messengers for the best arguments around climate change, which is to protect the environment for the health of a child born today. Those arguments have been shown from a communications standpoint to have the best chance at motivating action across disciplines. So we need to be in the game, and that means we need to understand that power is a big part of the game. And the more tables, you know, you heard my resume a little bit at the beginning there, the more tables of power I sit at, the more I realize how very, very, very important it is to have a seat at the table, because I've been part of enough conversations now to know that there are a lot of conversations that would have been very different had I not been there. So that means that the makeup of the people at the table really, really matters. There's evidence that having more women at the table leads to whether, and looking at studies, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in North America, there was a good study that tracked decision-making in provinces as the percentage of women in legislatures went up, more likely to take environmentally sustainable decisions, more likely to fund health and social care. And we know also that when we have a more diverse background in terms of other measures of diversity as well, that people bring their own experiences to the table and are able to inform a discussion in a much more textured way. So it's really, really important. These discussions that a lot of boards are having right now in terms of increasing diversity and anti-racism, from my perspective, that is very much about survival, about us just having the best ideas at the table. And so we need to be making sure that we can use our privilege in every circumstance to make sure that there's a group of diverse voices at the table at this critical moment in human history where we're trying to solve both emergencies at once. Now, we don't get taught a lot about change making at medical school as well. And I recognize that there's a variety of backgrounds on the call, but I think that this is generally relevant. So drawing on some of Marshall Gans's methodology, as well as some of the psychology of climate change and movement building, I generated this model, and this is really how I think about change making. And so I used to kind of think, like back in the day, that if I went into a room and I kind of told people a problem, they would change stuff. And it really doesn't work like that. The executive director that CAPE had about a decade ago, his name was Gideon Foreman. He now works, he's in charge of energy, I believe, at David Suzuki Foundation. He was like, Courtney, if you want to fix climate change, you need a target. And I was like, what do you mean? We need to do the things. And he's no, Courtney, you need a target. And so eventually I came to realize he was absolutely right. And the target we came up with as an organization was coal phase out. And we managed to lend the voice of health in partnership with a tremendous number of public health groups and community groups in Ontario to the drive for coal phase out in Ontario. And so you can see that this is an iterative process here. And so you start with the team, and the team in that situation was a coalition of community groups and health groups. They strategically chose to try to get the coal-fired power plants phased out for various reasons. And then the story that they told about that was around asthma and was around protecting health by virtue of decreasing air pollution. And so that narrative, that story is something that we really need to focus on creating as change makers. I used to think that I would say, let's phase out these coal-fired power plants because it will decrease greenhouse gas emissions. or greenhouse gas emissions, but that in fact fails in many cases to create approximate enough argument that somebody is motivated to change their behavior that Tuesday. Whereas if you're talking about reducing visits to the emergency department from asthma, that's something that everybody can really picture, and everybody wants good health for children. And so it turned out that that was a very effective story narrative. And the messengers of that narrative were the health practitioners for the reasons I mentioned earlier, usually amongst the most trusted natural spokespeople for the health argument. And that led to a series of tactics, which included meetings with decision makers, op-eds, et cetera, which led to the commitment to phase out coal in Ontario, which resulted in the biggest single reduction in greenhouse gas emissions of any policy measure ever in North America. That generated a sense of hope. It was like, oh, hey, we can do this. And very similar campaign was run in Alberta. Again, got a commitment to coal phase out in Alberta. And again, a similar campaign was run nationally, which allowed us to obtain an accelerated coal phase out commitment, which happened around about the same time that a relatively similar process in the UK had taken place. And Catherine McKenna and the UK's environment minister got along, and they got together and they said, okay, well, maybe we can start a club. And they started a club called the Powering Past Coal Alliance. I was lucky enough to speak at the launch. And what it has actually done, right before the world shut down, I was at a presentation by a policy worker who specializes in coal phase out, probably one of the biggest coal phase out nerds in the whole world. And he showed us a scatter plot of how the behavior of countries around the world, their policies had changed as the Powering Past Coal Alliance had begun to adjust norms. So we're all social beings, and we act. We respond to leadership, and we want to kind of be in the club. So thinking about the psychology of climate change and action is a really interesting way for us to be considering what our next move should be. So these are the action motivators that I was mentioning earlier. And so this is Marshall Ganz's methodology. He talks about urgency, being able to overcome inertia. That's when we're talking about, to hit 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to decrease emissions by X amount in X years. Anger, it's unjust that this is happening in terms of children. Hope, solidarity, and you can make a difference. So I've been spending a lot of time over the last couple of months thinking about hope, about the importance of solidarity, about gathering in groups like this to support one another, and also decrease the courage barriers involved in speaking out on this kind of thing, and in telling stories of successes, as I just did, to help emphasize this YCMAD, which is you can make a difference, and to be really thinking about these things very explicitly as I do my work. And so, we're at this moment where we have the opportunity to make the argument in a very different way, because back in the day when Greta was leading the big marches, we were trying to talk to a population in the world that had never really known an emergency. So I would say things like, think about your logistical supply chain in terms of climate change, and imagine how we're going to supply all of these universities and hospitals in the context of multiple malnutrition emergencies leading to conflict, displacement, closed borders. And people couldn't really picture it. Now everybody can picture that. And so we had a world, it's been disrupted. The Lego blocks are all on the floor, and we have an opportunity to put that back if we can influence in the right way. And talking about the planetary health emergency of COVID in terms of its status as a zoonotic infection is a way to connect the dots, because we know that climate change drives changes in habitat. And we know that these spillover events where an animal is in new proximity to humans are what generates and is most likely to generate future pandemics. So really we can be framing our work in climate change as a way also to prevent further pandemics. And so it's a way to connect the narratives to lend power to the data at a moment of real disruption that can bear fruit. And we're seeing people upping the ante in their personal work. So I think a lot of us recognize that like we are at a peak of opportunity and risk right now. And so I'm seeing a lot of people find their courage. So somebody as an example who really is doing this, Tim Takaro. So I've worked with Tim for years in terms of, calling for health impact assessments into various resource extraction projects, writing reports with him. And he essentially was part of every aspect of the consultation process behind the TMX pipeline. He essentially almost did a health impact assessment on his own time because the one that was done was so inadequate. And finally, in the summer, in the face of continued building of the TMX pipeline, he was like, look, I'm going to get up in a tree and I'm going to sit there for a week and block construction. And so that's where he's acting. And so I think that the spectrum of action for us to take advantage of this moment is really broadening. And we're seeing health practitioners around the world increasing their work. So we saw, despite the fact that we're in the pandemic, the NHS in the UK has just committed to net zero by 2040. So that's its scope 1 and scope 2, as well as part of the scope 3 emissions. And then they're committing to 2045 as a net zero for what they're calling the carbon footprint plus. So that initiative is led by Nick Watts, formerly my boss at the Lancet Countdown, literally the most brilliant functional human I've ever met in my entire life. And he's got 28 people working under him. I expect him to get this done because that's just the kind of person he is. So just in Canada, and you can see they have a plan where they've got a target for each one of the different elements of their greenhouse gas emissions. And they are doing this both to get it done, to decrease that proportion of the UK's emissions, also to stimulate work around the world, and also so healthcare practitioners can be seen as leading by example, which gives us additional stature within broader arguments, such as what Marcel was talking about. And so we thought it was time to up the ante here in Canada as well. So we convened just a very loose community of practice around planetary healthcare last week so that we can start to connect up the different conversations. Because right now there are a lot of people working on this in Canada, but we're not going to make the same kind of progress Nick's making in the UK unless we're all working together and we're entering these spaces with an attitude of assuming good intent, of trying to figure out which organization's unique value proposition and how interacts in what way with those of the other organizations. So we're not continuously reinventing the wheel, and we're handing off at the intersections as efficiently and in as collegial a way as possible. So there's tremendous interest in this. We're going to convene it on a rotating basis monthly. Next one, Neil Ritchie is convening. So if you're interested in joining, let us know. And this is a moment where the US is back. So climate change and health is up front. His new climate lead is Gina McCarthy, whose last job was to be the head of climate change, the Harvard Center on Climate Change and Health. So they're the people who actually were sponsoring the Lancet Countdown briefs in the US. So that means that right now, climate change and health framing has all of a sudden gone from a backwater where it's still not even in most medical education frameworks to any appreciable extent. And of course, there's many people working on that right now. But now basically the very top climate person in the most powerful country in the world is steeped in climate change and health work. And that's strategic because we know, again, from a communication standpoint, that this is the best way to motivate populations to take action around the world. And so we need to be increasing the pressure on the Canadian government to be making those connections and again, working internationally to lend our voice. So this is the Powering Past Coal Alliance launch that I was speaking to you about. I think there are ways that we can help the Canadian government gather other countries to be part of this. And this is some of the work that I'm doing with the WHO Global Climate and Health Alliance Working Group. But what was really striking about this, so I spoke for 2 minutes, all of these other like heads of countries spoke, and I had multiple people come up to me afterwards and tell me that I had done the most sort of persuasive speech. And the reason for that was because I can talk about patients. So this picture was taken just a little while after I had actually taken a puffer out of my pocket and I talked about kids with asthma, and I was speaking about my patients in the Arctic. And so we have the ability to tell human level stories, which policymakers have trouble accessing. And so just know that you own that, you have that ability as a healthcare provider. So in terms of the sort of nitty gritty of what we need to get done in terms of nationally determined contributions, what Marcel was talking about, I wrote this paper with Yasin Cholikov, who's a public health resident who's been very involved, actually just graduated, public health doctor, who's been very involved in climate change and health work, and Christian Holtz, who's a climate equity scholar. So if you'd like to sort of see our overall perspective on nationally determined contributions from a health standpoint, you can go take a look at this article. Essentially, the way I look at it is that our nationally determined contribution, the minimum amount of information that's required for that is the mitigation commitment. So we have to say, we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by X amount by X year. And then I think that the way we can best influence that as a health community is to then also propose various measures that sit within that, each of which decreases greenhouse gas emissions, and talk as much as we can about the health co-benefits of those actions. So talk about how many lives will be saved through the coal phase out, how much money that will save us in the healthcare system, and do that for, electric vehicle infrastructure, do that for different measures of agriculture, and do that systematically in every country. Make sure that we have appropriate materials. We're speaking with the Minister of Health. We're speaking with the Minister of the Environment. We're doing interviews and really making clear that this is what we need to do to protect the health of children born today as we emerge from this pandemic. Because now that we know what disruption and global health emergency feels like, none of us want to live through that again. And this is the way we prevent further similar global emergencies. And pretty interestingly, actually, the Lancet Countdown has joined forces with the Lancet Planetary Health to really lay out this argument for several countries. And that issue is going to be launching in about 2 weeks. So it looks like I'll be helping to lead some breakout sessions at the launch. So if you're interested, keep an eye out, because I think that this work in this is about to really ramp up. And so and at CAPE, we're looking at how we can situate a lot of the work that we're doing this year within this frame. We need to recognize that from a climate equity standpoint, a lot of the emissions reductions that Canada needs to be helping to steward are likely to take place outside of our shores because of the amount that essentially we've emitted over the years, and the fact that in many cases we'll be more efficient to do it elsewhere. And so our climate finance is really, really important. And this is all within the context of the conversation around decolonizing global health. When I was a graduating medical student, I thought that global health meant that I had to leave Canada. And I did. I went to work with Doctors Without Borders. And again, I'm very proud of the work I did with them. But when I think about it and you read about global inequality and how it was set up by colonialism, and is it in fact maintained by various ways that we've built the world order in a way that disadvantages lower and middle income countries, there's a lot we can do from here, and arguably even more. So how do we work in Canada to ensure that Canadian companies don't worsen health abroad, for instance, mining companies and local extraction practices? How do we ensure that the trade agreements that we sign contain a health impact assessment and don't disadvantage lower and middle income countries? We need to really view climate finance as part of our domestic climate policy and make sure that we're anteing up there. And how do we lean into multilateral institutions, support the WHO, support other organizations that are advocating within the global space, and make sure that we're lending our privilege to ensure that less powerful voices are around those tables of power. And so, something that came up for me when we hit, this pinnacle of risk and opportunity, and it was clear to me where we were at the beginning of COVID, or heading into the first sort of midway through the first wave, was, okay, so we have a lot to do. We have a lot to influence right now. Probably we need to do it from home. Is political work the new humanitarian mission? We haven't viewed it like that. I hadn't previously viewed it like that, but when you really think about it, maybe it is. And so really that's why I ran for office, because I think that really the biggest changes we're going to make on behalf of global health probably will come about as a result of policy implementation here. And I think it's important that we start to frame political work as that, because frankly, it was pretty much the same. It was the first time since I'd worked for MSF where I'd had so many people say, we think you'd be great at that job. We think that's an important job. And we really hope as your friend, you don't do it. Because it's your time, again, much like in humanitarian work, isn't your own. There are stresses on family life, etc. So how can we support and celebrate people who do this work? And I believe that many people on the call did help me feel that way and welcome that in a way so we get the best people coming into the space. Kate's executive director actually just recently took a leave to go seek a nomination in a riding in Ontario. And I frankly view that as a win. I'm sad for Kate, but I think to make the change we need to make in the world right now, we need people pretty close to the decision-making panel. We want evidence-based, humanitarian-minded people there. So we're gonna have to support them to go do the work. What needs doing right now? We need to make sure that Bill C-12 gets strengthened. This is sort of Canada's closest thing we've ever had to Climate Accountability Act. And it's a good step forward, what they put forward, but it needs strengthening. We need a 2025 target. We need strengthening of the independent advisory body's role. Targets should be legally binding. So this is something Kate is going to be looking at in the next little while. And it's interesting, we were talking about the donut. It does all come back to the need for a well-being economy. The more you read about GDP, the more it's absolutely asinine that this is the way we are measuring our progress as a nation. It doesn't correlate with well-being in high-income countries. It goes up when we do increased defense-related spending, increased disaster cleanup. We need to define what we think our objectives are, and the Canadian Index of Well-being is a good place to start. Figure out what the metrics and measurement are and create policies that optimize those. And until we figure out, basically as an emerge doc, I think about this, what are we resuscitating to? Like, what's our target blood pressure? And is that the right measure of what we want? So we need to make sure from a national achievement standpoint that our overall measures of national progress are aligned with what we want. And I think that at this moment of overlapping planetary health emergency, we all want health, safety, and well-being. And so let's create an overall structure and a set of metrics that acknowledges that makes us as well as we can as we weather these overlapping planetary health emergencies, and allows us to do that in a sustainable way so that our good days now aren't coming at the cost of good days for our children later. So that is essentially my presentation. And really, the more I do this, the more I realize that solidarity is probably the absolute most key thing. Lonely advocates burn out really quick. It's too scary. It's too hard. And so the more we can keep reaching out to one another and creating these communities of practice and supporting one another in the context of the pandemic and climate change, the more work we're going to do. And so one way of helping to create that is, I believe, to create a moment where people reframe and make a choice to join these communities. And this pledge for planetary health that I published in The Lancet with some colleagues a little while ago is that it's a Hippocratic oath for the Anthropocene. So as we're asking people to reframe their vision of health, giving people an opportunity to speak aloud via Zoom. I've done this with a few people and there's been tears. I think we're gonna see this a lot organized by the Global Climate and Health Alliance and other groups this year, as we're asking people, okay, we're at this momentous place in human history, let's reframe and let's recommit. And let's do that together. And so if people are interested, you can take a look at this as a tool and move forward together. So I'm sending much love out here from Yellowknife to you. I know everybody is living in the midst of rapids right now. And please let us know at CAPE how we can assist you in your efforts. And thanks for listening.
Yeah, well, thank you again, Courtney. I apologize. I guess there was feedback with things with Marcel. I don't know if there's feedback now. But we do have feedback from our audience a bit, and so I'll just try to summarize some of that. The first thing was about deep adaptation. So an environmentalist who has been very active on things wonders whether this would take away from resources needed for climate change mitigation, thinking about deep adaptation. And also, she wanted to thank you for mentioning gender and gender parity, and wonders about the importance of gender parity in terms of influencing direction and priorities. So I'll go with that question first, and then we'll talk about the role of physicians.
Sure. So I've actually been talking a lot more about adaptation lately than I used to, and it's because I'm really worried that we're forgetting about it. This new hospital that we have here is the biggest infrastructure investment the NWT has ever made. It cost more than our bridge to the south. It's a P3 partnership, and over the course of the summer, all of our operating room sterilization packs were coming out wet. And so we had to cancel a tremendous number of operating time. And after flying up consultant after consultant after consultant, the best answer people have so far come up with, and maybe we'll come up with something different, but this is where we're at right now, is that we built the hospital for the precipitation and temperature patterns of last century. And we had the second wettest summer ever in the NWT this summer, and the humidity level was just way higher. And so they think that that's why our operating room ended up being canceled and our sterilizers weren't coping. And so when you think about the fact that the Canada's Changing Climate Report, which came out about 1.5 years ago, shows that we're going to be 2 degrees Celsius warmer than 1986 to 2005 baseline here in Canada as a whole by 2040 to 2050, regardless of what we do now in terms of emissions. You know, we have 20 years to envision that and prepare for it. And every single time I show that graph, like this is one of the rare presentations I've given lately where I haven't shown that graph. Every single time I show it, everybody looks surprised. And I think it's because we've been giving a very important message around mitigation for a long time, but the message sometimes ends up coming out as if we don't decrease greenhouse gas emissions abruptly, bad things are going to happen. Instead of, we are now committed to a certain amount of climate disruption. And so we need to prepare for that at the same time as we're decreasing greenhouse gas emissions so that we can maintain a plateau after that that we'll be able to cope with. And we need to make sure that we're giving both of those messages. So I'm actually starting most of my presentations now with adaptation and moving to mitigation after that. That has to do with this wildfire project that that will be coming out soon. It's essentially an adaptation focused project. And the thing is, you know, I think one of the reasons we don't like talking about that is, again, because of the mental health burden associated with it. But really, one of the messages that came through very clearly in the qualitative analysis that we did was that the people who felt prepared felt way happier. And so preparation not only does good, but it feels good. So I actually think that likely we'll find that the more we talk about adaptation, the more empowered we're going to feel. And the more people will know naturally come to understand the material because they'll have to go through it to understand the adaptation requirements. I think that's actually going to help our mitigation work.
Okay, thank you. I think that some of the other questions also relate to what the most effective strategy is. And I think as you talked about Gideon's advice to you, John Howard also talked about that with regard to pesticides. And I think people are thinking about approaches within the medical community. And so whether we're finding more acceptance of these approaches. Another question relates to physicians are not necessarily politically savvy and are hampered by a lot of competing priorities like everyone else. If you had to pick a single pressure point for healthcare people to try to exert influence, where would you start? Political parties, provincial or national, medical associations, local MPs, local engagement with colleagues. So that's a second thing. And then a third thing that might be part of your answer perhaps is related to the planetary healthcare in Canada coordinating sustainable care, whether you wanted to talk about that, because you talked about the NHS and it wasn't David Pension, but somebody else you talked about in terms of adaptation there, just what we might do in Canada.
Sure. So we have made progress in terms of getting eco-health, planetary health concepts into the mainstream. So right before COVID shut down, I was booked for a keynote at pretty much every one of the giant conferences. So it would have been better if those had all happened before we went virtual. However, they're kind of trickling in a virtual world. And unfortunately, COVID is making it a lot easier, unfortunately, to make the case. And so I'm finding a great degree of openness. And so we actually just passed a strategic plan at the Canadian Medical Association that includes climate change and health. You may have seen in your newsletter that came out last week, the confirmation that the divestment resolutions that we passed in 2015 will also be applied to the sale of MD Financial. And so they're just actioning that right now. So that's $2.6 billion more funds that now the global health community has committed to divest. So we should be proud of that. The Canadian Federation of Nurses Unions passed a series of resolutions about 2 years ago that lent very strong support to climate and health action. The Canadian Nurses Association has also been focused on this. Canadian Public Health Association is very much on board. Canadian Federation of Medical Students Associations, super active. And so really, we're getting more and more contact with other groups. And so I think we can feel that, yes, progress is being made. However, we need to make sure that that progress is adequate and at the tables of power. So that means that if you happen to be somebody with a university appointment and a certain degree of power within your institution, there will be medical students or learners working on that. And if you can partner with them and mentor them and help them put their sharp elbows up and get to the curriculum table, that's really important. In terms of different levels of targets, so I think of change making on a micro, meso, and macro level scale. So micro being change making within your work or your practice. So, you know, switching to a dry powdered inhaler instead of a Ventolin that uses an aerosol propellant is a good first step in terms of your personal practice. Departmental hospital level, we'll be asking people to take a look at how your energy is supplied at your hospital. Can you advocate for a change to renewable energy? What's in your cafeteria? Can you switch things up to a planetary health option every time? Local suppliers. And then in terms of macro level national targets, I do think Bill C-12 is a big one, and I'm going to be connecting with other people nationally to figure out how we can lend our voice to that of the health community, or sorry, the environmental community. They have scholars who really analyze this really carefully. So I don't think we need to come up with our own set of asks. I think we're better off seeing what Canada generates and emphasizing their work and bringing the health rationale and voice to the topic. So we'll be thinking a lot about that. We need to be talking about a new NDC, nationally determined contribution for Canada. We need to be lending our voice really to these resource extraction projects. So my very first motion ever at the Canadian Medical Association General Council was asking the CMA to support increased peer-reviewed studies into the local health impacts of the oil sands. And it's a matter of deep shame to me that we haven't delivered on that as a national medical and research community. Chief Alan Adams was in Ottawa asking for that study right before the pandemic. He's also the chief who was then assaulted by the RCMP. So we can see how systemic racism plays into this. And that shows up in research. There's no way we would have communities as deeply impacted as those communities and not have done the studies. You know, I live in a city here where we had a gold mine really close to town, a giant mine. The Yellowknives DNA children died from the arsenic poisoning. And you know, when the study was done, this was back when my parents met here. So in the 60s, you know, when the study was finally done, I gave my kids toenail samples to that study last year. A 50-year lag time to take a look at the local health impacts of resource extraction projects in a high income country like Canada with excellent biomedical resource capacity is unacceptable. And so if that situation is in your community, and it very likely is because it's all over the place, it's fracking projects in northern BC and northern Alberta, it's different types of attempts to dump nuclear waste in all sorts of different places. We have a responsibility as practitioners, whether you're in the Canadian College of Family Practice or other Royal Colleges, to advocate for our patient population. We need to get that done. Like, it just makes me want to cry. It's awful. And so the research is important because that helps tell the story of why that project is unacceptable and what compensation the community may need. And so on a local level, really try to develop the courage and support one another in that work, support people like Tim who are putting their body on the line. And on a sort of national political level, making sure we're putting pressure on the government not to fund those, put more taxpayer money into pipelines that are going to, you know, A, cause local health impacts, and B, really reduce our ability to deliver on our climate commitments, as well as make sure that we create the framework we need with something like Bill C-12 to get us on a rational, target-based legislated approach to meeting our targets.
Thank you, Courtney. I think that we're now out of time, and really appreciate you once again. We got you in our last conference, but we had to cut things a bit short. So I'm glad we had a bit more time this time. I'm also glad that actually one of our Laurier professors is working on the Yellowknife mines aspect, somebody associated with the PEGASUS Institute. Yeah, I am so impressed with how you communicate. Rather sad that you came in third and did not take that, but I think we will have some leadership, hopefully, for the Green Party, and with you outside of that process too, to continue that. I'm impressed with how you motivate young people, your connections within medical schools and residency programs, how you're connected internationally with all of the major players. You're a wonderful advocate for climate change and other things, and your experience north and south is really amazing. So I want to thank you on behalf of the group for taking the time to present to us, even when we're busy with COVID and other things. So thank you, Courtney.
Thank you. Just about politics, what I learned is that fundraising is all anybody cares about. And so as we're trying to get more better, good people in, if a friend of yours runs, donate as much as you can right up front. I entered 3 months after the eventual winner, and it turns out that you can't make up that much of a fundraising gap. And so that's what I learned. So we need to learn these new games, and we can.
Yeah. And there are a few thank yous in the chats. For those of you who are interested in future PEGASUS events, we've got a couple of others planned in English. So remember, now we're moving to a more online format that we have the two that Camille has put up there. The first on refugees with Michaela Henia and Meb Rashid. Michaela is more of a research and policy type of person, and Meb is a family physician who's going to talk more about practice and advocacy. That's in the evening of February 24th. Then we have an event again on climate change with Sir Andy Haynes, former head of the London School of Hygiene and chair of different Lancet commissions. That'll be another noon event, and possibly with Dominique Souris, who heads up the Youth Climate Lab. So we expect that that'll be of interest to those of you who are interested in this. With the PEGASUS Institute, we're hoping to move well beyond conferences to engaging in social issues. We want to have more blogging, more articles. Courtney, again, the prolific author now. So we may want to include some of our speakers in terms of some of the outreach. We're going to have a couple of sessions, I expect, in the next few months in French. So one on refugees and migrants in Montreal, and a second on Ebola and the current pandemic and the disproportionate effect on Africa and how solutions also can be led from there. A session in Spanish on the US-Mexican border and migration. So a lot of issues that might be of interest to you. So we hope that you continue to be engaged with us. And once again, thanks to Courtney and Marcel, and stay healthy, stay safe, and let's take care of each other. Bye for now.